But the contents of the published matter are shuddersome enough, even if one accepts the general view that they but represent the ravings of a madman. There are, among many strange things I found, mention of the Black Stone, that curious, sinister monolith that broods among the mountains of Hungary, and about which so many dark legends cluster. Von Junzet did not devote much space to it. The bulk of his grim work concerns cults and objects of dark worship, which he maintained existed in his day. And it would seem the Black Stone represents some order or being lost and forgotten centuries ago. But he spoke of it as one of the keys, a phrase used many times by him in various relations, and constituting one of the obscurities of his work, and he hinted briefly at curious sights to be seen about the monolith on Midsummer Night. You know, the night closest to the sunset, to the solstice. He mentioned Otto Dostman's theory that this monolith was a remnant of the Hunnish invasion and had been erected to commemorate a victory of Attila over the Goths. Von Junzet contradicted this assertion without giving any refutatory facts, merely remarking that to attribute the origin of the Black Stone to the Huns was as logical as assuming that William the Conqueror reared Stonehenge. There's a lot of that goes on in archaeology. And the madness, insane people aren't always wrong, and sometimes they're brilliantly right. Why do you think a diagnosed schizophrenic, like, who's that guy? The Blaze. He was on Fox. Oh, I don't remember his name, but I should. This implication of enormous antiquity piqued my interest immensely, and after some difficulty I succeeded in locating a rat-eaten and moldering copy of Dostman's Remnants of Lost Empires, Berlin, 1809, Der Drachenhaus Press. I was disappointed to find that Dostman referred to the Black Stone even more briefly than had von Junzet, dismissing it with a few lines as an artifact comparatively modern in contrast with the Greco-Roman ruins of Asia Minor, which were his pet theme. He admitted his inability to make out the defaced characters on the monolith, but pronounced them unmistakably Mongoloid. However, little as I learned from Dostman, he did mention the name of the village adjacent to the Black Stone, Stragokovar, an ominous name, meaning something like Witch Town. Now, when you study a subject, one of the things you need to do is it's like, this book isn't solidly about the subject, but to get a wider amount or variety of some of the information, you're going to have to turn to books that aren't really about the subject, but you know there's going to be a reference, or there's a science that's connected. Like religion, you look into the sciences, and that gives you faith in the various issues. It tells you more about the situations or context or whatever. A close scrutiny of guidebooks and travel articles gave me no further information. Stragokovar, not on any map that I could find, lay in a wild, little frequented region, out of the path of casual tourists. But I did find subject for thought in Dornley's Magyar Folklore. In his chapter on dream myths, he mentions the Black Stone and tells of some curious superstition regarding it, especially the belief that if anyone sleeps in the vicinity of the monolith, that a person will be haunted by monstrous nightmares forever after, and he cited tales of the peasants regarding two curious people who ventured to visit the stone on Midsummer's Night, and who died raving mad because of something they saw there. Well, there is the negative aspect of being a mystic, because a mystic doesn't just have an experience, he lets himself be moved by the experience. Changed by the experience. That was all I could glean from Dornley, but my interest was even more intensely aroused as I sensed a distinct, sinister aura about the stone, the suggestions of dark antiquity, the recurring hint of unnatural events on Midsummer Night, touched some slumbering instinct in my being, as one senses rather than hears the flowing of some dark subterraneous river in the night, and I suddenly saw a connection between this stone and a certain weird and fantastic poem written by the mad poet Justin Jeffrey, The People of the Monolith. Inquiries led to the information that Jeffrey had indeed written that poem while traveling in Hungary, and I could not doubt that the Black Stone was the very monolith in which he referred in his strange verse. Reading his stanzas again, I felt once more that the strange dim stirrings of subconscious promptings that I had noticed when first reading of the stone. I had been casting about for a place to spend a short vacation, and I made up my mind. I went to Strigokovar. A train of obsolete style carried me from Temesvar to within striking distance at least of my objective, and a 3 days' ride and a jouncing coach brought me to the little village, which lay in a fertile valley high up in the fir-clad mountains. The journey itself was uneventful, but during the first day we passed the old battlefield of Skamval, where the brave Polish-Hungarian knight, Count Boris Vladanov, made his gallant and futile stand against the victorious hosts of Suleiman the Magnificent, when the Grand Turk swept over Eastern Europe in 1526. The driver of the coach pointed out to me a great heap of crumbling stones on a hill nearby, under which, he said, the bones of the brave Count lay. I remembered a passage from Larsen's Turkish Wars. After the skirmish in which the Count, with a small army, had beaten back the Turkish advance guard, the Count was standing beneath the half-ruined walls of the old castle on the hill, giving orders as to the disposition of his forces, when aid brought to him a small lacquered case, which had been taken from the body of the famous Turkish scribe and historian Selim Bahadur, who had fallen in the fight. The Count took therefrom a roll of parchment and began to read, but he had not read far before he turned very pale, without saying a word, replaced the parchment in a case, and thrust the case into his cloak. At that very instant, a hidden Turkish battery suddenly opened fire, and the balls striking the old castle, the Hungarians were horrified to see the walls crash down in ruin, completely covering the brave Count. Without a leader, the gallant little army was cut into pieces, and, in the war-swept years that followed, the bones of the noblemen were never recovered. Today the natives point out a huge and moldering pile of ruins near Skamval, beneath which, they say, still rest all that the centuries have left of Count Boris Vladanov. I found the village of Strigokovar, a dreamy, drowsy little village that apparently belied its sinister cognomen, a forgotten black eddy that progress had passed by. The quaint houses and quainter dress and manners of the people were those of an earlier century. They were friendly, mildly curious, but not inquisitive, though visitors from the outside world were extremely rare. 10 years ago, another American came here and stayed a few days in the village, so the owner of the tavern where I had put up, a young fellow and queer acting, mumbled to himself, a poet, I think. I know he must mean Justin Jeffrey. Yes, he was a poet, I answered, and he wrote a poem about a bit of scenery near this very village. Indeed, mine's host interest was aroused. Then, since all great poets are strange in their speech and actions, he must have achieved great fame, for his actions and conversations were the strangest of any man I knew. As is usual with artists, I answered, most of his recognition has come since his death. He is dead then. He died screaming in a madhouse 5 years ago. Too bad, sighed mine host sympathetically. Poor lad, he looked too long at the black stone. My heart gave a leap, but I masked my keen interest and said casually, I have heard something of this black stone. Somewhere near this village, is it not? Nearer than the Christian folk wish, he responded. Look. He drew me to a latticed window and pointed up at the fir-clad slopes of the brooding black mountains. There beyond, where you would see the bare face of that jutting-off cliff stands, that accursed stone. Would that it were ground to powder, and the powder flung into the Danube, to be carried into the deepest ocean. Once men tried to destroy the thing, but each man who laid hammer or maul against it came to an evil end. So now the people shun it. What is there so evil about it? I asked curiously. It is a demon-haunted thing, he answered uneasily, with the suggestion of a shudder. In my childhood, I knew a young man who came up from below and laughed at our traditions. In his full-heartedness, he went to the stone one midsummer's night, and at dawn stumbled into the village again, stricken dumb and mad. Something had shattered his brain and sealed his lips, for until the day of his death, which came soon after, he spoke only to utter terrible blasphemies, or to slaver gibberish. Now, there's a difference between blasphemy and just believing something different, and expressing that. But perhaps, this is fiction here, but perhaps when we hear things like this, it's that the Christians don't know how to deal with it. Particularly if it's something that's parallel to their own mythology. Not necessarily against much of the time, but just parallel. Or perhaps it's a part of the Bible that they don't really want to follow is connected to what they're talking about in some cases. My own nephew, when very small, was lost in the mountains and slept in the woods near the stone. And now, in his manhood, he is tortured by foul dreams, so that at times he makes the night hideous with his screams and wakes with cold sweat upon him. But let's talk of something else, Herr. It is not good to dwell upon such things. I remarked on the evident age of the tavern, and they answered with pride, the foundations are more than 400 years old. The original house was the only one in the village which was not burnt to the ground when Suleiman's devils swept through the mountains here. And the house that then stood on these same foundations, it is said, the scribe Selim Bahadur had his headquarters, while ravaging the country hereabouts. I learned, it's talking about an ethnocentric group that can't even accept better rule if it's, if it's connected to some other faith. I learned then that the present inhabitants of Strigokabur are not descendants of the people who dwelt there before the Turkish raid of 1526. The victorious Muslimin left no human living in the village or the vicinity hereabouts when they passed over. Men, women, and children they wiped out in one red holocaust of murder, leaving a vast stretch of country silent and utterly destroyed. Now, can we call these people Muslim? Perhaps they did enough if prayers or something to be considered as legal Muslim, but actually submitting to God. This is not part of the Islamic idea of warfare. There were instances, by the way, and the Turks had more of that problem than pretty much those before them, but men, women, and children, they wiped out in one red the present people of Strigokabur are descended from hardy settlers in the lower valleys who came into the upper levels and rebuilt the ruined village after the Turk was thrust back. Mine host did not speak of the extermination of the original inhabitants with any great resentment, and I learned that his ancestors in the lower levels had looked on the mountaineers with even more hatred and aversion than they regarded the Turks. And see, there was a lot of that going on. It's like, okay, if the Turks are bad, the people before were even worse. And, he was rather vague regarding the causes of this feud, but said that the original inhabitants of Stregokavar had been in the habit of making stealthy raids on the lowlands and stealing girls and children. We do see reference to bride kidnapping and stuff like this, and every other Muslim majority country actually has a death penalty for that sort of thing, but it certainly isn't legal in any of them. But that's some of the stuff and some of the cultures that they conquered. Moreover, he said that they were not exactly of the same blood as his own people. The sturdy, original Magyar Slavic stock had mixed and intermingled with the degraded aboriginal race until the breeds had blended, producing an unsavory amalgamation. Who these aborigines were, he had not the slightest idea, but maintained that they were pagans. Well, they certainly weren't carving houses out of stone and stuff, and had dwelt in the mountains since time immemorial, before the coming of the conquering peoples. Remember the Sakyas, the Gog and Magog, and coming down from the steppes of Asia? Juj, Wamajuj. But you know, it's not because of their ancestry, it's certain cultural choices that people made that make people superior or inferior. It's not, yeah. I attached little importance to this tale, seeing in it merely a parallel to the amalgamation of Celtic tribes with the Mediterranean Aborigines and the Galloway Hills, with the resultant mixed race, which, as Picts, has such an extensive part in Scottish legendary. Time has a curiously foreshadowing effect on folklore. Just as tales of the Picts became intertwined with legends of an older Mongoloid race, so eventually to the Picts was ascribed the repulsive appearance of the squat primitives whose individuality merged in the telling into Pictish tales and was forgotten. So I felt the supposed inhuman attributes of the first villagers of Stregoikavar could be traced to older, outworn myths with invading Huns and Mongols. The morning after my arrival, I received directions from my host, who gave them wordly, and set out to find the Black Stone. A few hours' tramp up the fir-covered slopes brought me to the face of the rugged stone cliffs, which dotted boldly from the mountainside. A narrow trail wound up it, and mounting this, I looked out over the peaceful valley of Stregokavar, which seemed to drowse, guarded on either hand by the great blue mountains. No huts or any sign of human tenancy showed between the cliffs whereon I stood and the village. I saw numbers of scattering farms in the valley, but all lay on the other side of Stregokavar, which itself seemed to shrink from the brooding slopes which maxed the Black Stone. The summit of the cliffs proved to be a sort of thickly wooded plateau. I made my way through the dense growth for a short distance and came to a wide glade, and in the center of the glade reared a gaunt figure of black stone. It was octagonal in shape, some 16 feet in height, at about 1.5 feet thick. It had once evidently been highly polished, but now the surface was thickly dinted, as if savage efforts had been made to demolish it. But the hammers had done little more than to flake off small bits of stone and mutilate the characters, which once had evidently marched in a spiraling line round and round the shaft to the top. Up to 10 feet from the base, these characters were almost completely blotted out, so that it was very difficult to trace the direction. Higher up, they were plainer, and I managed to squirm part of the way up the shaft and scanned them at close range. All were more or less defaced, but I was positive that they symbolized no language now remembered on the face of the earth. I'm fairly familiar with all hieroglyphics known to researchers and philologists, and I can say with certainty that those characters were like nothing of which I've ever read or heard. The nearest approach to them that I ever saw were some crude scratches on a gigantic and strangely symmetrical rock in a lost valley of Yucatan. I remember that when I pointed out these marks to the archaeologist who was my companion, he maintained that they either represented natural weathering or the idle scratchings of some Indian. To my theory that the rock was really the base of a long vanished column, he merely laughed, calling my attention to the dimensions of it, which suggested if it were built with any natural rules or architectural symmetry. A column 1,000 feet high, but I was not convinced. I will not say that the characters on the black stone were similar to those on the colossal rock in Yucatan, but one suggested the other. As to the substance of the monolith, again I was baffled. The stone of which it was composed was dully gleaming black, whose surface, where it was not dinted and roughed, created a curious illusion of semi-transparency. Runes and ohms, are what I think of. But even though this is fiction, I'm curious, to what's being described here. I spent most of the morning there and came away baffled. No connection of the stone with any other artifact in the world suggested itself to me. It was as if the monolith had been reared by alien hands in an age distant and apart from human ken. I returned to the village with my interest in no way abated. Now that I had seen the curious thing, my desire was still more keenly whetted to investigate the matter further, and to seek to learn by what strange hands and for what strange purpose the black stone had been reared in the long ago. I sought out the tavern keeper's nephew and questioned him in regard to his dreams. But he was vague, though willing to oblige. He did not mind discussing them, but was unable to describe them with any clarity. Though he dreamed the same dreams repeatedly, and though they were hideously vivid at the time, he left no distinct impression on his waking mind. He remembered them only as chaotic nightmares, through which huge, whirling fires shot lurid tongues of flame, and a black drum bellowed incessantly. One thing only he clearly remembered. In one dream he had seen the black stone, not on a mountain slope, but set like a spire on a colossal black castle. As for the rest of the villagers, I found them not inclined to talk about the stone, with the exception of the schoolmaster, a man of surprising education, who spent much more of his time out in the world than any of the rest. He was much interested in when I told him of von Junzit's remarks about the stone, and warmly agreed that the German author in the alleged age of the monolith. He believed that a coven had once existed in the vicinity, and that possibly all of the original villagers had been members of that fertility cult which once threatened to undermine European civilization and gave rise to the tales of witchcraft. He cited the very name of the village to prove his point. It had not been originally named Stregokover. He said, according to ledgers, the builders called it Xuthlatan. Zuthlatan, which had been the aboriginal name of the site on which the village had been built many centuries ago. The fact roused again an indescribable feeling of uneasiness. The barbarous name did not suggest any connection with Scythic, Slavic, or Mongolian race to which an aboriginal people of these mountains would, under natural circumstances, have belonged. Well, Xuthl kind of sounds similar to Volho. And, well, it's that category of sound, but that the Magyars and Slavs of the lower valley believed the original inhabitants of the village to be members of the witchcraft cult was evident, the schoolmaster said, by the name they gave it, which name continued to be used even after the older settlers had been massacred by the Turks and the village rebuilt by a cleaner and more wholesome breed. He did not believe that the members of the cult erected monoliths, but he did believe that they used it as a center of their activities, and repeating vague legends which had been handed down before the Turkish invasion, he advanced the theory that the degenerate villagers had used it as a sort of altar on which they offered human sacrifices, using as victims the girls and babies stolen from his own ancestors in the lower valleys. He discounted the myths of weird events on Midsummer Night, as well as a curious legend of a strange entity, which the witch people of Thotplatan were said to have invoked with the chants and wild rituals of flagellation and slaughter. He had never visited the stone on Midsummer Night, he said, but he would not fear to do so. Whatever had existed or taken place there in the past had been long engulfed in the mist of time and oblivion. The black stone had lost its meaning, save as a link to a dead and dusty past. Well, mythology is supposed to be kept living, but, certain practices maybe, and beliefs maybe not. It was while returning from a visit with the schoolmaster one night, about a week after my arrival at Strigokvar, that a sudden recollection struck me. It was Midsummer's Night, the very time that the legends linked with grisly implications to the Black Stone. I turned away from the tavern and strode swiftly through the village. Strigokvar lay silent. The villagers retired early. I saw no one as I passed rapidly out of the village and up into the firs, which maxed the mountain slopes in a weird light and etched the shadows blackly. No wind blew through the firs, but a mysteriously intangible rustling and whispering was abroad. Surely on such nights and past centuries, my whimsical imagination told me, naked witches astride magic broomsticks had flown across this valley, pursued by jeering, demoniac familiars. I came to the cliffs. Were they... Is it anise or fennel or something like that? I came to the cliffs and was somewhat disquieted to note that the elusive moonlight lent them a subtle appearance I had not noticed before. In the weird light they appeared less like natural cliffs, and more like the ruins of Cyclopean and Titan-reared battlements, jutting from the mountain slope. Shaking off this hallucination with difficulty, I came upon the plateau and hesitated a moment before I plunged into the brooding darkness of the woods. A sort of breathless tenseness hung over the shadows, like an unseen monster holding its breath, lest it scare away its prey. I shook off the sensation, a natural one, considering the eeriness of the place and its evil reputation, and made my way through the wood, experiencing a most unpleasant sensation that I was being followed, and halting once, sure that something clammy and unstable had brushed against my face in the darkness. I came out into the glade and saw the tall monolith rearing its gaunt height above the sward. At the edge of the woods, on the side toward the cliff, was a stone which formed a sort of natural seat. I sat down reflecting that it was probably while there that the mad poet Justin Jaffrey had written his fantastic People of the Monolith. Mine host thought that it was the stone which caused Jaffrey's insanity, but the seeds of madness had been sown in the poet's brain long before he ever came to Strigoi. I glanced at my watch, showed that the hour of midnight was close at hand. I leaned back, awaiting whatever ghostly demonstration might appear, a thin night wind started up among the branches of the firs, with an uncanny suggestion of faint, unseen pipes, whispering in an eerie and evil tune. Whispering an eerie and evil tune. The monotony of the sound and my steady gazing at the monolith produced a sort of self-hypnosis upon me. I grew drowsy. I fought this feeling, but sleep stole on me in spite of myself. The monolith seemed to sway and dance, strangely distorted to my gaze, and then I slept. I opened my eyes and sought to rise, but lay still as if an icy hand gripped me helplessly. Cold terror stole over me. The glade was no longer deserted. It was thronged by a silent crowd of strange people, and my distended eyes took in strange, barbaric details of costume, which my reason told me were archaic and forgotten even in this backward land. Surely, I thought, these are villagers who have come here to hold some fantastic conclave, but another glance told me these people were not of the folk of Stregoikavar. They were a shorter, more squat race, whose brows were lower, whose faces were broader and duller. Some had Slavic or Magyar features, but those features were degraded from a mixture of some baser alien strain I could not classify. Many wore the hides of wild beasts, and their whole appearance, both men and women, was one of sensual brutishness. They terrified and repelled me, but they gave me no heed. They formed a vast half-circle in front of the monolith and began a sort of chant, flinging their arms in unison and weaving their bodies rhythmically from the waist upward. All eyes were fixed on the top of the stone, which they seemed to be invoking. But the strangest of all was the dimness of their voices. Not 50 yards from me, hundreds of men and women were unmistakably lifting their voices in a wild chant, yet those voices came to me as a faint, indistinguishable murmur, as if from across a vast leagues of space or time. Before the monolith stood a sort of brazier from which a vile, nauseous yellow smoke billowed upwards, curling curiously in an undulating spiral around the black shaft like a vast, unstable serpent. On one side of this brazier lay two figures, a young girl, stark naked and bound hand and foot, and an infant apparently only a few months old. On the other side of this brazier squatted a hideous old hag with a queer sort of black drum on her lap. This drum she beat with slow, light blows upon her open palms, but I could not hear the sound. Now, a woman without wrinkles is often what they mean by a young girl, but they might mean a child, so I'm not sure.